The desert highway was nearly empty at sunset, just long stretches of fading orange light and the low hum of wind brushing against the asphalt. Inside a small roadside diner on the edge of town, Steven Seagal sat alone in a corner booth. No spotlight, no entourage, no one asking for photos, just black coffee and silence. He wore simple clothes, dark jacket, boots, nothing flashy. To anyone passing by, he looked like a quiet, older man enjoying a peaceful evening. The waitress had already stopped checking on him. He carried himself like someone who didn't need much. Then the silence broke. The roar of motorcycle engines tore through the calm like thunder. Heads turned. A pack of bikers rolled into the parking lot. Loud pipes, heavy boots, leather jackets. Laughter echoed before the engines even died. When groups move like that, tight, unified, amplified by noise, something shifts psychologically. Individually, a person might hesitate before confronting a stranger, but in a pack, confidence multiplies, ego inflates, risk feels smaller. The diner doors swung open. 5 bikers stepped inside. They scanned the room the way some people do, not looking for food, but looking for attention. And then one of them noticed Steven. He nudged the others. "Hey, check this out." Steven didn't look up immediately. He simply took another sip of coffee. One biker smirked. "You training for a movie or something, old man?" A few customers shifted uncomfortably. Steven slowly raised his eyes, calm, unreadable. "No," he replied evenly, "just having coffee." The leader of the group stepped closer to his booth, boots heavy against the floor. "Well," he said, leaning down slightly, "you're sitting in our usual spot." There was no sign, no reservation, just an excuse. Steven glanced at the empty tables around the diner. "There are plenty of seats," he said quietly. A chair scraped loudly as one biker dragged it back, intentionally, aggressively, just inches from Steven's table. The energy in the room tightened. Here's the truth about moments like this. Most conflicts don't start with violence. They start with testing. Testing tone, testing boundaries, testing whether someone will shrink. One biker tapped the edge of Steven's table with 2 fingers. "You sure you don't want to move?" Steven set his cup down carefully. Outside, the sky darkened. Inside, the tension rose.
Let me ask you something. If you were sitting there, what would you do? Would you ignore them and keep drinking your coffee? Or would you stand up immediately? Comment ignore or stand below.
Because what happened next changed the entire atmosphere of that diner. The word hung in the air. Move. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The biker standing closest to Steven rested one hand on the table now, leaning in just enough to invade his space. The other bikers spread out casually behind him, forming a loose half-circle around the booth. It was subtle, strategic. They weren't just talking anymore. They were positioning. Steven remained seated. His breathing didn't change. His shoulders didn't tense. He didn't look at the floor, and he didn't stare them down either. He simply held eye contact with the leader. Calm, balanced, present. That calmness irritated them more than defiance would have. "You deaf?" Another biker chimed in. "We said this is our spot." Steven glanced at the empty tables again. "There are plenty of seats," he repeated evenly. A fork clattered in the background. Someone shifted in their booth. The waitress froze near the counter, unsure whether to intervene. Here's something most people don't realize about confrontation. Bullies don't actually look for a fight. They look for a reaction. Fear, anger, submission. Any of those feed the ego. But calm? Calm feels like resistance without aggression.
and that's unsettling. The leader let out a short laugh. You think you're tough or something? Stephen tilted his head slightly. No. That answer caught them off guard. One biker grabbed the sugar dispenser from the table and rolled it between his palms. Another casually knocked Stephen's spoon onto the floor. Still, Stephen didn't move. Say it. The leader pressed. Say you'll move. Stephen folded his hands on the table. I'm not bothering anyone, he said. And I'm not moving. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. One of the bikers stepped closer and deliberately bumped the edge of the table with his thigh. Coffee rippled in the cup. A few drops spilled over the rim. Gasps came from somewhere near the window. The leader leaned down until his shadow fell across Stephen's face. You got guts, he muttered, sitting there like you've got backup. Stephen looked past him briefly, not at the door, not at the parking lot, just scanning the room calmly before returning his gaze. I don't need backup to drink coffee, he replied. The men behind the leader chuckled, but it wasn't confident laughter anymore. It was sharper, defensive. Because something felt off. Most people in that situation would have stood up by now, or apologized, or left. But Stephen stayed seated. And psychologically, that creates imbalance. When one side escalates and the other doesn't respond emotionally, the aggressor feels exposed, like they're performing, and no one's applauding. The leader straightened up. Maybe you don't understand how this works, voice dropping lower. He reached forward and slowly pushed Stephen's coffee cup. It tipped. Dark liquid spilled across the table and dripped onto the floor. Silence. Not even the kitchen made noise now. Stephen looked down at the sprained stain. Then he stood up. Not fast. Not explosive. Just deliberate. And that shift from seated to standing changed the energy instantly. The bikers weren't small men. But when Stephen rose to his full height, something about his posture made them adjust their footing unconsciously. Shoulders squared, feet planted, eyes steady. No theatrics. Just presence. You just made a mess, Stephen said calmly, looking at the spilled coffee. The leader smirked, though there was hesitation now. Yeah, what are you going to do about it? Stephen didn't answer immediately. He simply stepped out of the booth. Now they were standing face to face. No table between them. This is the moment where most confrontations explode. Adrenaline spikes, voices rise, someone swings. But Stephen's voice stayed level. I'm giving you an opportunity, he said quietly, to rethink this. A few customers instinctively reached for their phones. One biker scoffed. Is that a threat? No, Stephen replied. It's advice. That word hit harder than a punch. Advice. Not warning. Not threat. Advice. The leader's jaw tightened. Behind him, one biker glanced toward the parking lot through the window, just briefly. Like he suddenly felt exposed. Who do you think you are? The leader demanded. He held his gaze. No one you need to impress, he answered. A heavy silence followed. Outside, the wind picked up dust across the highway. Inside, tension coiled tighter. Let me ask you something. Do you think staying calm in a situation like this makes you stronger? Or does it invite more disrespect? I want your honest opinion. Because in the next few minutes, someone made a decision that would bring consequences none of them were expecting. And 20 minutes later, engines would be heard again.
The diner felt smaller now. Not physically, but emotionally. Every eye was locked on the two men standing in the center of it. The biker leader cracked his neck slowly, trying to reclaim dominance through posture alone. His crew shifted behind him, boots scraping lightly against tile. One crossed his arms, another smirked. A third kept glancing toward the windows, as if calculating something. Stephen didn't move. He didn't puff his chest. He didn't clench his vests. He didn't lean forward. He just stood there, balanced, grounded, like a man who had already decided how this would end. And that's when something subtle began to change. You see, confrontation runs on energy. Aggression feeds on reaction. Fear fuels escalation. Noise builds momentum. But when one person refuses to contribute emotional energy, the dynamic begins to starve. The leader stepped closer, close enough that their boots nearly touched. "You're real calm," he said quietly. "Too calm." Stephen met his eyes. "Should I be nervous?" he asked. The biker's jaw flexed. He wasn't used to being asked questions. He was used to giving them. One of the men behind him chuckled. "Maybe he doesn't know who we are." Stephen glanced briefly at the leather cuts, the patches, the insignias. "I see exactly who you are," he said. That line landed differently than expected. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't impressed. It was observational. And psychologically, being seen without being feared creates discomfort. The leader shoved him. Not hard, but intentional. A clear escalation. Stephen rocked back half an inch, then reset his stance without effort. No anger flashed in his eyes. No adrenaline spike showed on his face. Just stillness. A woman near the counter covered her mouth. Someone whispered, "This is about to get bad." Here's what most people don't understand about physical intimidation. When someone shoves you, they're not just testing your balance, they're testing your emotional threshold. Will you explode? Will you retreat? Will you crumble? Stephen did none of the three. Instead, he asked calmly, "Is that necessary?" The simplicity of the question hit harder than retaliation would have. The leader laughed, but it sounded forced now. "You think you're teaching a class or something?" "No," Stephen replied. "I think you're trying to prove something." Silence. That one sentence cracked the surface. Because deep down, that's often what aggression is. Performance. Performance for friends. Performance for ego. Performance for identity. And when someone calls that out calmly, the mask starts slipping. One biker stepped forward suddenly and grabbed the collar of Stephen's jacket. Gasps erupted across the diner. Phones were fully raised now, recording. The biker tightened his grip. "You talk too much," he muttered. Stephen slowly looked down at the hand on his collar, then back up into the man's eyes. "Take your hand off me," he said quietly. There was no growl in his voice, no threat, no raised tone, just a boundary. And here's something powerful about boundaries. When delivered without emotion, they force the other person to make a choice, escalate, or step back. For a split second, the biker hesitated. That hesitation didn't go unnoticed. The leader saw it. Ego doesn't tolerate hesitation. "Don't back down now," the leader snapped at his own man. Peer pressure, the invisible fuel of pack behavior. When individuals act in groups, responsibility diffuses. Courage increases artificially. Doubt becomes dangerous. The biker tightened his grip again. Stephen didn't flinch. But something in his eyes changed. Not anger, decision. He gently, almost effortlessly, removed the biker's hand from his collar. No dramatic twist, no flashy move, just precise control. The biker stumbled back half a step, shocked more by how easily it happened than by the motion itself. The room froze. The leader's smirk vanished. What was that? One biker muttered under his breath. Stephen didn't answer. Instead, he adjusted his jacket calmly. "You're confusing restraint with weakness," he said. That sentence hit the entire group, because deep down they had been. They mistook silence for fear, stillness for submission, age for vulnerability. But restraint is chosen, and choice implies power. The leader stepped forward again, this time more cautious. "You think you can handle all of us?" he asked. Stephen shook his head slightly. "That's not the point." "Then what is it?" the leader pressed. Stephen glanced toward the window, not nervously, but thoughtfully. "The point," he said, "is that you're making decisions you can't undo." The words felt heavier than they sounded. A faint siren echoed in the far distance, or maybe it was just wind bouncing off the highway. No one could tell. But it made two of the bikers glance outside again. Confidence was thinning. You can actually watch dominance fade in real time when certainty disappears. Posture changes, voices soften, movements become less exaggerated. The leader felt it slipping, so he did the one thing people do when control fades. He escalated. He swung. Not a full punch, more of a fast shove aimed at Stephen's shoulder. And that's when the energy in the room shifted completely. Because Stephen didn't block it aggressively, he redirected it. Smooth, efficient, controlled. The leader lost balance and stumbled sideways into a chair. The sound of wood scraping tile echoed loudly. No one breathed. Stephen didn't advance, didn't capitalize, didn't attack. He simply stood there, balanced, ready, but unmoved. That was the moment fear entered the equation. Not fear of violence, fear of miscalculation. The bikers had assumed they were dealing with an ordinary man. They were no longer sure. Let me ask you this. Be honest. If you were one of those bikers right now, would you double down out of pride or step back before things got worse? Comment pride or step back. Because Outside, in the distance, engines were about to be heard again. And this time, they weren't motorcycles. The sound started low, so low at first that no one inside the diner reacted. The bikers were still frozen in a strange standoff, pride clashing with uncertainty. Their leader stood upright again, brushing dust off his sleeve as if that could restore his authority. But something had shifted. Not just in the room, in them. Confidence built on assumption is fragile. The moment doubt enters, ego becomes defensive instead of dominant. Stephen stood exactly where he had been. No victory stance, no smirk, no attempt to humiliate anyone. That restraint was more unsettling than aggression ever could be. Outside, the faint hum grew louder. One biker glanced toward the window again. "You hear that?" he muttered. "Probably trucks all highway," another replied quickly, too quickly. Denial is often the first reaction when reality starts contradicting confidence. The leader pointed at Stephen again, trying to regain momentum. "This isn't over," he said. "You got lucky." Stephen tilted his head slightly. "Luck usually looks chaotic," he replied calmly. "This isn't that." That answer didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like certainty. And certainty, in tense moments, feels heavier than intimidation. The engines grew louder now. Not the rumbling roar of motorcycles. Something smoother, more controlled, coordinated. Outside the dusty diner windows, headlights appeared over the small hill leading into the parking lot. One SUV, then another, then a third. All black, all moving with quiet precision. The diner went silent again. Even the kitchen stopped clattering. The bikers turned slowly toward the glass. No one spoke. The vehicles didn't screech or rev dramatically. They rolled in calmly, evenly spaced, stopping in formation near the entrance. That detail mattered, because randomness suggests coincidence. Formation suggests intent. Inside the diner, you could almost feel the psychological recalculation happening in real time. One biker swallowed hard. Another shifted his weight backward unconsciously. The leader forced a laugh. "What is this?" he said. "You call your buddies?" Stephen's eyes remained steady. "I didn't call anyone," he replied. That statement confused them more than if he had claimed responsibility. Because if he didn't call them, then who did? Here's something fascinating about human psychology. When a group feels powerful, they expand. When uncertainty enters, they contract. The same men who had spread out confidently now stood closer together without realizing it. Outside, the SUV doors opened almost in sync. Men stepped out. Not in flashy uniforms. Not yelling commands. But there was something unmistakable about their posture. Disciplined. Aware. Controlled. They scanned the parking lot once. Quick. Efficient. Then their attention shifted toward the diner. The leader's smirk faded completely. One of the bikers whispered, "Who are those guys?" No one answered. Inside, customers instinctively moved away from the windows. Phones were still recording. Stephen finally adjusted his jacket slightly. Not nervously. Just preparing to step outside. The leader noticed. "Don't walk away," he snapped, trying to sound commanding again. Stephen looked at him evenly. "I'm not walking away," he said. "I'm stepping forward." That sentence hit differently, because stepping forward implies intention. He walked toward the door at a calm, measured pace. The bikers hesitated. This was the psychological tipping point. Follow him, and risk whatever waited outside. Stay inside, and appear afraid. Ego hates appearing afraid. So they followed. The bell above the diner door jingled softly as Stephen stepped into the evening air. The desert wind had cooled. Dust drifted lightly across the parking lot. The men who had exited the SUVs stood spaced apart now. Not aggressive, but alert. One of them took a step forward. Not toward the bikers. Toward Stephen. And then something subtle happened. He nodded. Not casually. Not socially. Respectfully. "Sir," he said. That one word changed everything. The bikers felt it instantly. Don carries hierarchy. And that tone carried recognition. The leader looked between Stephen and the men near the vehicles.
Confusion gave way to realization, or at least suspicion. Who are these guys? He demanded. Stephen didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the group of bikers. You had 20 minutes. That's how long it takes for small decisions to become big consequences. The words weren't dramatic. They were instructional. And that made them heavier. Here's the truth about consequences. They rarely arrive loudly. They arrive precisely. The men knew the SUVs didn't draw weapons, didn't shout, didn't posture. They simply stood ready. And readiness is more intimidating than noise. The leader's voice was no longer steady. You military or something? He asked one of the men. The man didn't answer him. His attention stayed on Stephen, awaiting direction. Because real power doesn't scramble. It waits for instruction. Let me ask you something. If you were standing there as one of those bikers, what would you be feeling right now? Fear, regret, denial. Comment your honest answer below. Because the next word spoken in that parking lot would completely flip the balance of power.
The desert wind moved quietly between them. Dust drifted across the parking lot, brushing against boots that only minutes ago had stomped confidently into the diner. Now those same boots were planted, but no longer certain. The men who stepped out of the black SUVs stood in calm formation. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just composed. Precision without noise. One of them, tall, controlled, unmistakably disciplined, kept his eyes on Stephen. "Sir," he repeated respectfully. That word echoed louder than any engine had. The biker leader tried to laugh it off. "This some kind of joke?" he said, glancing at his crew. "You bring security now?" Stephen didn't respond to the insult. He looked at the men near the vehicles and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not commanding, just acknowledging. Then he turned back to the bikers. "You had chances to walk away," he said calmly. The leader's jaw tightened. "Walk away from what? You spilled some coffee." Stephen shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "You spilled respect." Silence. Here's something about moments like this. When a power shift happens, it's rarely loud. It's subtle. Tone changes, breathing changes, posture changes. The bikers, who once stood wide and expansive, now seemed closer together. Pack confidence was thinning. One of the men near the SUVs stepped forward slightly, not threatening, just enough to clarify presence. The biker leader pointed at him. "Who are you guys supposed to be?" The man didn't answer him. Instead, his eyes remained on Stephen, awaiting instruction. Because discipline understands hierarchy, and right now, hierarchy had flipped. Stephen folded his hands calmly in front of him. "You mistook silence for weakness," he said. "You mistook patience for fear, and you mistook numbers for strength." Each sentence landed heavier than the last. The leader's voice rose defensively. "You think we're scared?" Stephen studied him carefully. "I think," he said evenly, "you're realizing something." That was the crack, because realization is louder than intimidation. One biker shifted backward unconsciously. Another cleared his throat. The leader felt control slipping again, and ego doesn't surrender easily. "So what?" he snapped. "You gonna have your buddies scare us?" Stephen glanced briefly at the men behind him. "They're not here to scare anyone," he said. The statement confused everyone. One of the disciplined men finally spoke, calm, measured. "We respond when called," he said simply. The leader frowned. "Called by who?" Stephen's eyes didn't leave the biker's face. "You think power announces itself?" he asked quietly. That line carried weight, because real authority doesn't brag. It exists, whether recognized or not. Here's the psychological truth. Arrogance operates on visible signals, loud bikes, leather jackets, group numbers. But structured power operates quietly, through coordination, loyalty, and readiness. And the bikers were beginning to understand that difference. The leader tried one last attempt at dominance. He stepped forward again, but this time it wasn't aggressive, it was testing. "You're just some old guy," he muttered. "Who exactly do you think you are?" Stephen held his gaze. "No one you should have tested without thinking." That wasn't a threat, it was a lesson. The desert air felt heavier now. Phones were still recording from inside the diner windows. The situation could have exploded at any second earlier, but now it felt controlled, contained. Because the presence behind Stephen wasn't chaotic, it was disciplined, and discipline changes everything. One of the bikers finally spoke up, quieter than before. "Maybe we should just roll." That suggestion would have been unthinkable 20 minutes ago. The leader heard it. So did everyone else.
Pure confidence was dissolving, and when the group loses emotional alignment, the strongest personality no longer dominates, it defends. Stephen stepped one pace closer, not invading space, just closing distance enough to ensure clarity. No one here needs to get hurt, he said calmly, but understand something. He paused deliberately. When you move through the world assuming no consequences, eventually you meet them. No raised voice, no dramatic pause, just truth. The disciplined men behind him remained steady, not a single unnecessary movement, and that steadiness was the loudest statement of all.
Let me ask you honestly, do you think the bikers deserve to be humiliated right here? Or is realizing their mistake enough? Type humble them or listen learned in the comments. Because what happened next proved that real strength doesn't need revenge. It only needs control. The parking lot was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, the heavy kind, the kind that follows realization. The biker leader looked around slowly, at his crew, at the black SUVs, at the disciplined men standing with controlled posture, and finally back at Stephen. 20 minutes ago, he had walked into the diner like he owned the room. Now he was recalculating every choice he had made. That's the thing about confidence built on assumption. It collapses the moment new information enters the equation. One of the disciplined men stepped half a pace forward. "Sir," he said calmly, eyes on Stephen, "how would you like this handled?" That sentence alone changed the entire atmosphere, because it revealed something critical. They weren't here to act on emotion. They were here to follow instruction, and the instruction would come from Stephen. The biker leader swallowed. "Handled," he repeated, trying to sound steady. "We didn't do anything." Stephen turned his attention fully back to him. "You intimidated customers," he said evenly. "You escalated a situation without reason. And you assumed there would be no response." The leader opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, because arguing now would only expose insecurity. Here's something important about moments like this. When someone realizes they misjudged power, their brain shifts from dominance mode to survival mode. You can see it physically. Shoulders lower, voices soften, breathing becomes shallow. One biker finally removed his sunglasses, something small but symbolic, a barrier coming down. Another avoided eye contact entirely. The pack energy was gone. Now they were just individuals standing in the consequences of group behavior. Stephen took one slow step forward. Not aggressive, just present. "You had multiple chances to walk away," he said. "Every step after that was a choice." The leader forced a smirk that didn't hold. "So what now?" he asked. Behind Stephen, the disciplined men stood still as statues. They weren't flexing authority. They were embodying it, and that difference matters. Power that needs to shout is insecure. Power that stands quietly is confident. Stephen looked at the group carefully, studying their faces one by one. He wasn't scanning for weakness. He was measuring understanding. "Now," he said calmly, "you decide what kind of men you are." That wasn't what the bikers expected. They expected threats, maybe arrests, maybe force. Instead, they were given responsibility. And responsibility feels heavier than punishment. The leader frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Stephen held his gaze. "It means you can double down on pride," he said, "or you can recognize you miscalculated and leave differently than you arrived." Silence. The desert wind brushed past them again. Inside the diner, people were still watching through the glass, phones raised, breath held. One of the bikers shifted uncomfortably. "Man, let's just go," he muttered quietly to the leader. Peer pressure had reversed direction. Earlier it pushed toward escalation. Now it pushed toward retreat. That's how group psychology works. The dominant emotional current determines the flow. And right now, fear of further consequences was stronger than pride. The leader looked at the disciplined men again. "Who are you guys anyway?" he asked. One of them finally answered, calm, direct. "We protect what matters." No rank, no explanation, no bragging, just a statement. And sometimes mystery is more powerful than credentials.
The leader looked back at Stephen. "You some kind of big shot?" he asked. He shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "I'm someone who believes in accountability." That answer landed harder than any title would have, because titles invite challenge. Principles demand reflection. The leader exhaled slowly. For the first time since walking into the diner, he wasn't performing. He was thinking. That's the shift. When aggression turns into thought, escalation ends. He glanced at his crew. "Mount up," he said quietly. No shouting, no dramatic exit, just acceptance. The bikers began walking back toward their motorcycles. The same boots that stomped in loudly now moved with measured steps. No one laughed, no one mocked. One biker paused briefly, glancing back at Stephen, not with anger, with something closer to respect. Engines started again, but this time the sound felt smaller, less dominant, more like retreat than arrival. As the motorcycles pulled away from the lot and disappeared down the highway, the tension finally broke. Inside the diner, someone exhaled loudly. A few people clapped softly. Stephen didn't react to the applause. He turned toward the disciplined men. "It's handled," he said calmly. The tall man nodded. "Yes, sir." And just like that, the formation dissolved. Doors closed. Engines started. Smooth, controlled. The black SUVs pulled away as quietly as they had arrived. No sirens, no spectacle, just precision. Within moments, the parking lot was empty again. Only desert wind and fading tire tracks remained. Stephen stood there for a second longer, looking out at the highway. Then he adjusted his jacket and walked back toward the diner. No celebration, no victory pose. Just composure.
Let me ask you something important. Do you think giving someone the chance to walk away is stronger than forcing them to submit? Or should disrespect always be met with harsher consequences? Comment second chance or no mercy below.
Let me ask you something important. Do you think giving someone the chance to walk away is stronger than forcing them to submit? Or should disrespect always be met with harsher consequences? Comment second chance or no mercy below. By the next morning, the small desert diner was no longer just a quiet stop off the highway. It was everywhere. Clips from inside the restaurant, footage from the parking lot, different angles, different captions. The internet had done what it always does. It amplified the moment. Some videos were titled, "Bikers picked the wrong guy." Others said, "Calm man silences entire gang without throwing a punch." But what caught people's attention wasn't the SUVs. It wasn't the formation. It wasn't even the confrontation. It was Stephen's composure. Millions of people watched the same thing over and over. The shove, the redirection, the stillness, the choice not to escalate. Here's what fascinated viewers most. At any point, that situation could have exploded. One punch, one angry reaction, one ego-driven decision. Instead, it ended with restraint. And restraint is rare in a world that rewards loud reactions. Comment sections exploded with debate. Some people wrote, "He should have taught them a real lesson." Others said, "That's what real strength looks like." Psychologically, moments like this trigger projection. People don't just watch the conflict, they insert themselves into it. They imagine what they would have done. Would they have reacted emotionally? Would they have tried to dominate? Would they have walked away? The video kept circulating. Podcasts discussed it. Reaction channels analyzed body language. Former military commentators talked about discipline and presence. But the most shared clip wasn't the confrontation. It was the moment Stephen said, "You're confusing restraint with weakness." That line struck something deeper. Because in everyday life, people experience that misunderstanding constantly. Quiet people are underestimated. Patient people are tested. Calm people are mistaken for fragile. The diner released a short statement later that week saying, no charges were filed, no one was injured, and the situation had been resolved peacefully. That word mattered. Peacefully. Stephen himself didn't post about it. He didn't brag. He didn't retweet clips. He didn't give interviews. Silence again. And ironically, that silence made the story grow even more. Because mystery fuels attention.
A week later, a reporter briefly caught up with him outside a training facility and asked, "Do you think the bikers deserved harsher consequences?" Stephen paused before answering. "No," he said calmly. "I think they deserved a moment to think." That answer divided the internet again. Some called it wisdom. Others called it softness. But here's the deeper truth. When someone expects violence and receives discipline instead, it forces reflection. Punishment can create resentment. Reflection can create change. We don't know what those bikers thought later that night. We don't know if they laughed it off, or replayed the moment in silence. But we do know one thing. They rode in loud. They left quiet. And sometimes that shift is enough. The video eventually slowed in views, as viral stories do. But the discussion didn't disappear, because the core question remained. What is real strength? Is it domination? Is it retaliation? Or is it control?
Now, I want your honest opinion. If you were in Stephen's position, would you have handled it the same way? Or do you believe some situations demand a harder response? Type control if you believe restraint is true power. Type force if you believe respect must sometimes be enforced physically. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just about bikers. It was about ego, about perception, about how quickly we judge someone based on appearance, and about what happens when we judge wrong.